Welcome everyone to our CAPE Dialogue, What is a Classroom? I'm Scott Sikkema, Education Director at CAPE. I'd like to just mention a couple of technical things first. As we hear from each presenter, please put your questions or comments in the chat box. We will hopefully have time for dialogue and questions after all four presenters at the end. But in the meantime, rather than calling out questions, please put your questions or comments in the chat box. If you have technical issues, Brandon is here to take care of that or help with that. Again, put that in the chat box if you have technical issues. I also want to mention that we're recording tonight's CAPE Dialogue, What is a Classroom? All right, before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to introduce our topic, What is a Classroom, with my own personal memories and questions in relation to defining a classroom in our present context of remote and hybrid learning. Next slide. First, memory. What is a classroom as an inquiry question was first asked in a CAPE context almost 20 years ago now, back in the school year 2002-2003. Next slide. Art and design teacher Phil Cotton and CAPE teaching artist Margie Stover began working together that year with a group of middle school age students who were themselves just beginning in a brand new school building. The students were having difficulty adjusting to the building and to each other. They had come from different schools from around the neighborhood, and they were having trouble adjusting to it. Talking with the students, Phil and Margie realized that the classroom itself could become the content that the students could investigate and create anew in a way that would make the school a more generative place for themselves. Now, when Phil and Margie shared the question, what is a classroom, with the students, after further discussion, the students decided to focus in on chairs. Next slide. Noticing that students often have very different chairs than the adults in the school. And so they analyzed the difference between adult chairs and student chairs. They then developed concepts and proposals for their own individual chairs, moving from drawings, next slide, to maquettes, next slide, to scaled plans to final constructions they could sit on. Next slide. And the next slide. Phil and Margie's approach to examining school and classroom as context and construct to be challenged and reinvented by students has continued to this day. My thanks to them for their inspiration and for their inquiry question we're using tonight. And at the end of our panelists' presentations, I'd like to ask them for their responses. Next slide. So as I ask the question, what is a classroom? I say to myself, is it space? And I turn here myself to geographer Doreen Massey. Next slide. Doreen Massey's concept of space as something that is never finished, but is instead continuously co-constructed by people and things in their interactions and dialogues is, I think, relevant here in our current situation. Next slide. This is a quote from Doreen Massey's From Space book. And you'll note that she talks in the end. I'll let you take a moment to look at it. So she ends by saying space will always be unfinished and open. And that reminded me of a recent project I was looking at again from Boone Elementary School. Next slide. This is a 2018 project. It's not from this school year, but Boone students working with their teacher, Gustavo Soto, and CAPE teaching artist, Gwen Terry, they worked with Gustavo and Gwen in a restructuring and redesigning of their entire classroom. And we're investigating to see if this more open and restructured design would create a kind of security that would allow them to voice themselves more readily. And they debated notions of security and safety and things like that in dialogues and in texts that they posted around the room. But they also brought in parents as well to engage in these conversations. As you can see there in the back, those adult figures are actually parents visiting the classroom. So for me, when I think of space and I think about during masking, I think of this work, I ask if we think of the classroom as never finished and instead always becoming, could that help us guide through our current challenges? Next slide. What is a classroom? Is it the body or the architecture or both? Next slide. Conceptual artists and architects Shusaku Arakawa and Madeline Gins aim to create in individuals an architectural body that is an individual's body. Your body would itself be architectural in its new capacities of spatial awareness and perception when you would experience one of the structures that Arakawa and Gins designed. Let's look at some quotes of directions for one of their structures. Next slide. These are instructions for a park setting that they created. Instead of being fearful of losing your balance, look forward to it. Next slide. Juggling, jumbling, and reshuffling the body with its fund of landing sites. Landing sites is what they refer to as the senses, our senses. Introduces a person to the process that constitutes being a person. Next slide. Let's look at the structure. I'll give you a taste of this. This is a park that they designed in Japan. Next slide. Another view of another part of the park. And next slide. This is the interior of one of the park buildings. As we see from these instructions and from the photos of this park project, there's a continuous engagement of mind and body in unexpected ways. Arakawa stated, quote, "The actions that occur, twisting your legs, having meals, going to the toilet, give rise to a phenomenon I call architectural body." So for me, thinking of the body, I ask, when we think of teaching remotely, can we create not a literal architecture of the school, but the architectural body Arakawa and Gins expounded towards a greater awareness of self and context for the student? Next slide. What is a classroom? Is it a narrative? Next slide. Italian designer Bruno Munari focused a great deal of his work on children's books and toys. These products display Munari's understanding of design as narrative, but not a narrative that is univocal and linear. Rather, he sought to disjoint narrative linearity and throw off narrative expectations so that the viewer or the reader or the player could construct their own narrative arcs and form their own narrative protagonists and characters. Next slide. This slide and the next slide I have these are two different toys. They're like image cards that he created for children to perform their own narrative construction. Next slide. Here's another one. And next slide. And this is something he created for the children's narrative construction, literally through a spatial or physical construction. This was for children who didn't have their own rooms or bedrooms. He designed this modular unit in 1971 that they could arrange and rearrange different components and where the bed was in the building, and then hang and drape and attach different things to this structure in order that they could create a kind of narrative of this bedroom space. It could be a castle, or it could be an astronaut's capsule, etc. Next slide. This is a poem that he wrote about it. Abitacola is an environment that can adapt to the inhabitant's personality and change at any time. And next slide. So when I think about this, remote learning offers an opportunity to rethink and break apart the old classroom narratives. So for me, thinking of narrative, I ask, what narratives can we newly generate and assemble now together for students to form a classroom. Next slide. Finally, is a classroom made of who's in it, what's in it, and how the who finds the what? Next slide. We see this in the explorations of CAPE students and artists and teachers this year, such as this Waters Elementary student of Leticia Ramos and Arama Tamian perceiving an overlooked part of his basement in a project that references Guy Debord's concept of the Dreve. Next slide. Or these at-home pantry still life constructivist sculptures created by students of Shaniqua Brooks and Jackie Limon at New Sullivan Elementary. The students at home finding what they can in order to construct these new sculptural components. What is a classroom generates many questions for me and no one answer, and perhaps that's the point. Thinking about these student investigations, I recall that Arakawa and Ginn stated they hoped people who entered their structures would start with the question, where am I? And then come to the larger question of, what am I? Next slide. To fully probe our question tonight of what is a classroom, I am pleased to welcome our panelists in the order they will present. Gustavo Jardim is a filmmaker and educator working in Brazil and in Chicago for CAPE with teacher Whitney Jean and students at South Shore Fine Arts Academy. He coordinates cinema and education programs and develops methodologies for the use of cinema in inclusive pedagogies with communities with high rates of social risk. Dr. Juana Reyes is assistant professor in the College of Education and Social Sciences at Lewis University. She has focused on early childhood education as well as bilingual and special education in her work with university students, and is adept on the Reggio Emilia system of preschools in Italy and Reggio practices in Chicago in the United States. Bianca Castillero is an artist and art educator based in Mexico City, working with both primary and university students. Her work addresses the relationship between textile art practices and education, and she has done recent work with educators on mapping via indigenous textile making. And Dr. Erica Halverson is professor of curriculum and instruction at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. She is interested in how learning happens in and through the arts with a focus on performing arts. Her many publications include a focus on maker spaces in education and an upcoming publication on how the arts can save education. And so now I turn it over to Brandon, who'll turn it over to Gustavo.
Okay, hi everyone. So nice to be here. I'm happy and honored to be part of this. Thank you so much, Scott, for the invitation and for the kind introduction. And interesting introduction, I should say. It already gave ideas to, I'd like to start the debate right now. It was really good. Well, I was an artist teacher at CAPE last spring. I'm working again with CAPE this year. We're just preparing our material for this year's, for next spring classes. So I really don't have an answer for the question in the title, but I brought some ideas from the area in which I investigate, and I hope we can share some thoughts on that. Although I make films, I can't really make a PowerPoint presentation, so I just brought some images from films, especially because I'd like to add some images and some history of images to think about this title question, what is a classroom? I'm so happy to be here with Dr. Juana, Bianca, and Erica. Thank you, Mark and Brandon, so much for all the support as well. Well, I'll start because we don't have much time. And I'd like to do that with 3 different images from 3 different films from last century. This is one first image. I don't know if everyone has ever seen it. It comes from the movie Zero for Conduct by Jean Vigo. It's a film 1933. This film was shown for the first time and then it was banned and then people could see it only again after the Second World War. I brought this film, especially, it has inspired so many other films in the history of art. I brought it especially because I think there's an initial statement coming from cinema of art that is trying to fight the idea of the school all over the century, and even the idea of the classroom. In this film, we see these four rebellious boys that this is the final scene. I'm sure for art films, there are no spoilers, so I'm happy to show this here. When they take over the school, I mean, they're fighting this educational establishment full of repression and bureaucracies. And these kids will take over in this wonderful scene. We could call it a masterpiece. And I bring it as a first image to have in mind how much art has challenged the ways of educational systems. So that will be a start image. We could go to the next one, please, Brandon. This is from Abbas Kiarostami, Where is My Friend's House? I'm sure most of you must be familiar with this movie. I brought this because I think there's an interesting question that's raised by Kiarostami in this film, and it should also be part of our discussions tonight. It's a film that our friend on the right, he forgets his book, his notebook in the classroom. And our friend in the left sees that, and he's afraid that if he doesn't hand it in the next day, he might be expelled. So they're under a very, it's a repressive system. The teacher is very, it's an authority against them. And with that in mind, he takes his notebook, and the history of the film will take us across the city because his friends lives in a neighboring village. And the interesting thing about that is when he leaves the school is when the actual learning starts. That's when the film starts to teach us things that we're going to cross the whole city until we'll try to get to our friend's house. So that's a second point. It's not really against school here, but it's something that could be increased in the process of learning. And we feel that as spectators of the film. I brought a third image. If we could see it, please, Brandon. So this is a film, I consider it a masterpiece too, by Straub and Rouillet. It's called Un Hachanchon. It is said to be a non-translatable word. So, but if we try to take some parts of it, it will be considered like spine or recreate or spit it out or sing. I'll explain it better. This is, the film comes from a plot written by Marguerite Duras. It's called Oh Ernest. The kid in the scene is Ernest. And this film starts with mom is in the kitchen, dad's in the kitchen, and the little Ernest says, I shall not go back to school anymore. He has decided that. That's how the film starts. And while mom and dad, they are scared, and dad asks him, why not? And he says, because at school, they only teach us what we don't know. I shall not go back to school because at school, they only teach us what we don't know. Well, mom and dad, they find it outrageous in the beginning. They take him to school. They talk to the headmaster. Everyone has a meeting with Ernest, and the headmaster asks him, so how would you learn? So we have here a kid that doesn't want to go to school because we only teach things that they don't know. So how will you learn things that you have to learn? And Ernest answers, inevitably. And then he asks, but what's the method for that? And he answers, un hachanchon, which is the name of the movie. An untranslatable word, it's a mystery word. We can think of that, let's keep that in mind. But I'd like to go back to his first answer. I don't want to go to school because there they only teach what we don't know. So we can go back now, Brandon, to the presentation. I go back to the films in the end. So it was interesting that when I first met Miss Whitney Jean, I don't know if she's with us tonight. We worked together at South Shore Fine Arts Academy. And when we started, one question we had was how to approach the kids. We're working with kids from 11 to 13 years old. And one thing that was very important was to find out what were the kids doing, or how were they doing, or what were they interested in. The first conversations with Ms. John were really important. And that's where we got the idea that the kids were producing a lot of films with dances. They were making dances to the camera. It's really interesting. I've been working on a research to understand the use of experimental cinema in education. I've worked a lot with modern and classic cinema, and I've in my research, I've been using recently experimental cinema as a way of getting to languages or cinematographic language that were not yet invented. And in the possibility of working with the teacher in the classroom, I felt that we could understand an environment before trying to impose a certain form of language. So Ms. Jean said the kids were into dancing for the camera. And that's where our exercises started to be planned. The story I'm gonna tell has a turning point, which everybody knows. It's the pandemic. So I will tell how we planned, and then after that, how we did. So how would we plan something? Because we wanted the kids to be engaged in the community, in activities that would concern the community and the environment and the place where South Shore Fine Arts is and what is happening around the school. That was in our mind. We really wanted to make connections with the outside of the classroom. That was before the pandemics, and that was already in our mind. So we came up with this exercise to make dances that would be able to connect the body with the environment, or connect the body with the community around, or with family, or with the past, or with the future. I'd like to show 3 other films, more experimental. Please, Brandon, the next 3 ones. We selected together, and that was a very interesting exercise, to select films where the filmmakers were making their dances and the body was not the limit for the dance. It's a sort of explosion of the limits of the body to connect with the environment around. Here we see Ana P, Brazilian artist. That movie is called Birds and Spines. And the film happens with the sound of the birds that are singing off screen. She's in the middle of this cactus, and for every singing that the birds make, she will make a different position. If you look at her hands and if you look at her body, she's also mocking the cactus themselves. So it's weird because when you're watching it with the sound of the bird, at a certain point, everything seems to be dancing together. she took a paradox, she took something that came from off screen, off the limits, and made a mixture, I'd say, of all the bodies involved in it. In the next film, Brandon, please. This is by Julie Dash. She made this film with Nina Simone. Nina Simone is singing. And what's amazing, the name of the film is For Women. What's amazing here is that for every dance, we're connecting a part of history. Like there are 4 acts for 4 different women, and for every dance, a part of the Black history, especially, is being connected with the body. So here again, we don't really see the body of the dancer in this scene. We shall see it in other scenes, but it's again a possibility of going a bit further from the individual to connect with histories that are around us, and maybe really in the past, maybe contemporary histories. For the last one, Brandon, please. Well, this is an old movie, also made by a Afro-American filmmaker called Zora Neale Hurston. Zora, well, it's a very special story. She was born in Alabama, and then she moved to Florida when she was 3 years old to an all-Black citizens town. She lived there a long time, and then I'm summing up because, I mean, Zora is a multi-artist. She has done so many things. So I just want to focus in the gesture she's making to make this film called Children's Game. So she goes to Columbia, and she's a student with Franz Boas, which is, I mean, considered father of American anthropology. I think I could put it like that. And nowadays, I think how much has Boas taken from Zora and how much Zora has taken from Boas. But Zora is going to make a piece in the ethnographic sense. And what she decides to do is she goes back to her hometown and she starts filming her own people and the dances and the baptism culture and people staying in the porches. And she makes, I mean, a collection of many short films that are put together, were just restored. And she adds something here that will be for the rest of history of cinema and, I mean, anthropology as well, which is the place of who is looking at it and how everyone is part of the same problematic. I mean, Zora is filming herself while she's filming her own town. I mean, it's a time when anthropology started to go to places to study the other, and then she makes this huge step for cinema as well. So I guess those 3 examples show a little of how we thought we could work, how we were thinking. And I like the introduction that Scott just made to think the space and the body, and how does that become a narrative? I mean, how does that create a new sense of time? And it's pretty much what's happening here. In the experimental position that we are analyzing here, the filmmaker is also part of what he's filming. I mean, on the first film with Anna P., she is there with her friend. We can hear her friend behind the camera, and the friend is pointing out different birds that are singing, just so the dance could be different for every bird. And we could work on something that we might call a singularity. I mean, a possibility of the encounter, of the meeting, telling us what is to come, or something that is part of an event that takes place not only in the word, but also in language, in creating new things. So this was the idea we had. This was what we planned, and we are still talking about this: how to explode the limits of the body and promote this mixture of elements when looking at the places where we are, and what can we take from the singularities of the meetings we have. Well, that was all planned on the 6th of March this year. On the 13th of March this year, schools closed down in Chicago. I was there as a fellow PhD student. I came back to Brazil. We had to plan the whole thing over to see how it would work for remote learning. Well, that taught us so much. The exercise I'm going to show right after this one is what we started to think in the same idea of taking out the body and trying to connect the body with the neighborhood, with other elements around the body. It was a simple exercise. We can go to the next chart, Brandon, please. The students would have to take a photograph of themselves in which they didn't appear. So that was just basically what we did. Like, so we're taking out, again, the body out of the scene, but trying to reflect our feelings in what we are seeing. Because I was working with Miss Jean and it was a literacy class, we took so much from the writing behind the pictures that were taken. In this case, for example, we have the student, it's a photo of a battery, and she wrote, "I'm a battery. I help people do things they can't do alone by themselves. Though I can help people do things, but I can also shock you." It was interesting to see how the images and the literacy part went together, because usually when we're making films together, we have the opportunity to move with the camera, to see different angles. And here I should highlight that we were starting to face a very difficult part of the pandemics for us that work with public schools, especially in the south of Chicago or in the villages of Brazil where I work now. 50% of the kids had access to internet, and even when they have access, it's hard to find time and the ideal time and place to have the classes going. So this first exercise showed us so much. We have another example there, Brandon, we could see it. So this person took a photograph of a box and said, "I'm a box, I can go from place to place and change my appearance, but I will always be same inside. If you ship me to you, I will be with you forever. And if you throw me away, I will never be back. If you recycle me, you have a second chance with me, but it's not likely." There are so many good photographs that showed we could work with texts to open up the meanings of what they were looking. And we're trying to get the chance to improve the ways the photographs could show what they wanted in the things they were looking at. But then an underlining question came to us about the idea of remote learning and being with the kids, and that is, how is it possible to have solutions for a new classroom that will not increase the stress and inequality? I mean, how is it possible? Because for us, what has been shown is that inequality has grown, and it's impressive, and it's quite frustrating. So the ideas of a new classroom are all there, but they should definitely face this inequality problem. But I mean, after that, we start planning. We had 2 other exercises planned. I don't know. Maybe I'm going over the time, Scott.
You're about. Let's wrap it up. Like, yeah.
Okay. So I'll just mention the last exercise for that year. We were thinking how is it possible to, even in the situation that we were with little access, that we could have actions, or better, interactions between the students, that it wouldn't be, because we're thinking about the difference of to be in the classroom and to go on a class line. So what we made mostly was we start to make short videos that people wouldn't have to be in time or on the time that we were available for them. So people would use the class as a timeline. But here I want to go away from the idea of a chronological timeline. We're more linked to the idea of a line of flight, in the way Gilles Deleuze uses it, in a line that you can engage on your own activities and bring new meanings for the whole when you make it. I mean, you can, the idea of virtual came from this. I mean, it's something that is ideal, but nonetheless real. So if you engage yourself in a line of flight, you can bring new meanings for everyone. So we planned one last exercise that has a lot to do, and we're still thinking about that, with architecture and time. And our idea was to build a house in a film. We wanted every student in class to build a part of a house that would be finished in a film. So we could use, instead of cement, sand, and water, we would use cuts and understand what is continuity and what is a raccord, which is something that goes from one scene to another thing to another scene in cinema. That made us think a lot of the possibilities of making people to engage in activities in which there is something really important about what the other person is doing or what you're generating in common.
Well, I think
So
the line of flight is a beautiful answer. One of the answers to what is a classroom. Um, thank you, Gustavo. That was
okay.
fantastic. I loved it.
Thank
And
you
we've
very
got a
much.
lot of questions in the chat about the films that you shared. So if
Okay.
you have a chance, you might type in some more information about them.
All right.
Thank you, Gustavo. And now we are going to welcome Dr. Juana Reyes.
Let me unmute myself. I'm preparing my screen to share. Can you all see the screen? I think so, yes? Okay, yes. Good. Okay, great. All right then. So I work with, as Scott had said earlier, I work with both pre-service and in-service early education teachers who will work with children under the 8 years of age. 8 years, I'm sorry, under 8 years. So I just want to share some experiences that I'm going to draw on this afternoon to set up my presentation. Early in my career, I actually worked at Chicago Commons, which is an agency that is committed to using aspects of the Reggio Emilia approach. And I started working there in the early 90s at the beginning of their exploration with this approach to the education of young children. And so what I'd like to invite us to do tonight is to reimagine education with a courage to leap. So education oftentimes is referred to using metaphors. We've used a couple of metaphors already this evening, right? And I'd like to invite us to think about the metaphor of the wall. And also to think about different possibilities about what we consider a classroom to be. So if the eye leaps over the wall, to do this, I want to frame my presentation with the idea that was put forward in the earliest exhibit of the Schools of Reggio Emilia. And the title of the exhibit is The Eye If It Leaps Over the Wall. So I would like to kind of keep that in the back of our mind, this idea of an eye leaping over the wall. And I thought we could go through and share, I'm going to share some images of different walls in the world and think about what these walls, the implications of these walls. Okay, so first, you might notice the path that leads towards this wall here. And you might wonder where it's leading because it seems to be ending right into the wall, right? You might imagine what's on the other side of this wall. You might imagine that on the other side, there's something that needs light because there's a light present on the other side. You might wonder about what people are doing on the other side of the wall. And you might wonder why it's erected. So some walls are actually erected because of power imbalances, right? This is another wall. You might be, it's a much shorter wall. The other one was quite tall and near impossible to get over, right? This wall is, you could actually step over this wall if you can see down the middle of the screen here in a diagonal line. So if you're standing right at this wall, you might imagine who made this wall. While it's made of natural materials, it's a man-made wall. But then you can also see in the background another set of a wall of hills, right? Hills that form a different type of wall. So a wall that is actually created by nature. So you see both the human and nature-made walls. Some walls are created to reinforce long established practices, and sometimes we take these practices for granted, right? They can also define binaries, so safe and unsafe. So while it's safe for infants to be in this little pod so that the toddlers that are toddling around the classroom don't smash their toes and fingers as they roll around in this little pod, there's also a division in the classroom of these tiny walls for the toddlers, right? There might be activities that happen on one side and not the other side. There are also walls that imply in or out or asleep and awake. So on one side of this wall, there might be sleeping occurring, and on the other side, there might be an abundance of activities. So they can also define active and quiet spaces. Windows can also provide a wall, and as they are here at the top of the Rockefeller Center. And here sometimes walls are taken down, but they still are used to define what once was. And at the time when they were erected, it might have showed what qualified or was unqualified or good or bad, right? It might have created a very strong definition. So a wall can be a symbol of life before an event and the possibility of life after the wall. So it can actually provide a demarcation in our lives, right? So what happened before, and then after we cross through an event, what happens on the other side? So I would like us to consider if the pandemic for us could be a wall that in which we consider what education is before and what education becomes, what it becomes after. So also considering the notion of classroom, what a classroom might look like before and what it might look like after. And classrooms that children are in now are not unlike classrooms that I was in first and second grade, right? And there are actually, they might be a little bit more towards the academics, but there's a lot of similarities in classrooms, even the classroom that my mother was in. There are a lot of similarities to these classrooms. But could this pandemic be a time where we really rethink and re-envision education? It's a unique time for us as educators to consider how we can reimagine education. How can we look forward to an education that values relationships and the co-construction of understanding? Malaguzzi invites us to consider this notion of joy in education. In fact, he states nothing without joy. So once again, if we consider this idea of the eye, if it leaps over the wall, Malaguzzi pointed out that the meaning behind this was that the I, the mind, represents either the mind or pedagogy or the education of a child. The I begins to see, to reason, and to renew itself, and to the extent that it's able to leap over this wall, the wall of the banal, the rhetorical wall of conformity, of inertia, and official reticence. So I invite us tonight to take the courage to leap, to think, to reimagine and re-envision something different on the other side of this pandemic for education. So I'm going to share an example of something that I did over the summer with synchronous remote learning with graduate students that I work with at Lewis. So oftentimes we think of a classroom as bound by four walls, right? And we've, as educators, we've had to rethink what that means, what space means, what can occur within a learning environment, and what the learning environment looks like. And we shouldn't bind ourselves within these four walls and think that that's what defines us and our learning. So one thing we have to caution is that our virtual experience isn't just an extension of that, what happened within those four walls prior to the pandemic, where the teacher's doing a lot of talking, the children are doing a lot of listening, but there's little interaction and little opportunities for the children to talk and share and engage. So week one of the summer course, I actually had discovered this small egg on a plant in my garden, on a dill plant. And I decided to share this with the students. So over the course of 3 weeks in the early spring, we followed this egg as it developed into, let's see what it develops into, right? So we made observations every week. And this was the first week that we discovered the egg. And then the second week, so the way we were able to do this at first, it was just through photographs that I shared with them. And then I was able to connect a digital camera. And so you can see here the egg is progressing. And later that afternoon, the instar emerged from the egg. So what I used to share with the students, you might be able to notice, this is a digital microscope, and it is connects wirelessly to telephones or laptop computers. And so I would connect wirelessly and actually share, we would watch the instar here as it emerged from the egg, and it actually did a turnaround. And I just didn't have enough time to show the short film, but he turned around and consumed his egg, and then went on consuming the dill through the course of the week. So here we are observing, this is another, just a closer look at the setup of the microscope. The following week, the caterpillar began to form a chrysalis, and then eventually emerged. So some of the tools that we thought we would use with children. So in this dialogue, we talked about how we would use this as a tool with children. So even though I'm using it here with master students, and we talked about how would we engage children with this. So we talked about taking photographs, having video, having dialogue, audio recording of the dialogue, and then replaying or sharing what children had shared previously. We also decided that children could do observational drawings and perhaps write stories or even letters to the insect. Here, the butterfly is after it's emerged. So what children learn doesn't follow as an automatic result from what we teach. This is really important. What children learn is not an automatic result of what we teach. Rather, it's in large part due to the children's own doing as a consequence of their activities and our resources. So we may have an agenda as teachers that's quite different from that of the children, and we have to acknowledge that. We might have an agenda, but the children come into the classroom as well. whether it's a virtual classroom or a physical classroom, they come into the classroom with an agenda as well. And we have to recognize that that's a space that should be negotiated, and it shouldn't be an agenda that comes from outside the classroom as it often does, right? So another example that I'm going to share, this is an example that happened many years ago at Chicago Commons when teachers were using a nearby outdoor space. I felt like this could be something that could lend itself during this period of remote learning and perhaps give us some clues or opportunities for beyond remote learning. So this was actually, these photographs are taken from the We Are All Explorers book. And when we began by taking children around the neighborhood to actually observe more closely their neighborhood. And so some children decided that they wanted to look down, and we gave them magnifying glasses, and the other children decided that they wanted to look up, so they received binoculars so that they could look up when they went through the neighborhood. And of course, one of the children became very enamored with pipes and the system of pipes at a construction site. So that began inspired a study with a small group of children. So they actually explored pipes and what they could do, how water moved through the pipes. And this, I'm going to just show you some drawings from one of the children. So this is Jonathan's first drawing of pipes and how they might work. So this is a sewer drain off the sidewalk and what happens underneath of the sewer drain. And here's an example of oil pipes, and you see a lot of movement of the oil coming in and out of this silo. And here in the third drawing, Jonathan was exploring the bathtub in his own home. And this is his first drawing of the bathtub, his second drawing, and in the third drawing, I'm going to share with you the dialogue between Jonathan and his teacher. So Jonathan says, this is a shower. The water comes up and out, and it comes from here, the faucet. And then the teacher says, well, how does the water get out of the tub? And Jonathan draws a drain in the tub. And then she says, well, then where does it go after it leaves the drain? So he drew a pipe that went out from the drain. And the teacher says, and then where does it go? And he says, it goes right here into this cup. And then they put it in bottles and sell it to people. So I want us to think about our journey together and how we can use our context to learn together and strengthen our relationship. Consider our resources. Can the outdoors play a more central role to learning? So my setting is the city of Chicago. I live in the city of Chicago, but I work in a much wider, greater area of Chicago. But this is just an example of the hardscape in the city and juxtaposed also with prairie landscape that was put in by man. And then here's a more of a natural prairie. It's managed, of course. Most land in our country is managed. But so children can use this sort of prairie scape as well if they're a little bit further outside of Chicago. This is in a forest preserve in Cook County. So again, just with this idea of looking up, having the opportunity to look up or look down and consider what they might see. Consider that they might find a space for hiding or a space for a creature to live. So just some more opportunities for spaces, more natural space. And then also to consider this, maybe find an object and consider how it became the way it is, right? Not where we're offering answers about what this is and what's happening with this leaf, but where children can kind of make some hypotheses about what is happening. They might find a shadow outside in interesting and unusual place, or they might find also a different perspective to lay on the ground and look up above. So education is a mixture of complex interactions, many of which take place only when the setting is involved. So we have to consider our setting And I'll just leave us with some questions to consider. What part of the environment am I overlooking? How can I add to it or change the environment? What and how can I offer materials? What provocations can I offer to children and to families as well, because they're very much involved in this learning process? How can I document this experience, and what is my role? And I want to leave you with nothing without joy. So how can we maintain and spread joy among ourselves as educators, but also with children and families, and hold joy as we move beyond this wall of the pandemic and think about and reimagine a future for the classroom? Thank you.
Thank you, Juana. Wonderful and joyous. Bianca, we will now hear from Bianca Castillero next.
Hi everyone. Hi Scott, thank you all. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to screen share. Just give me 1 second. Okay, that's it. Okay, I'm there. Okay, so you can link a lot of concepts that Scott, Juana, and Gustavo already talked about with what I'm going to present to you. I'm going to say again, what is a classroom, right? That's the question. So the point of departure to answer that question is my own work as an art educator. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what I do with my own students. So I just want to tell you that my work involves textiles and education. So I use the possibilities and the materiality of the textiles to teach different topics. The truth is that I'm not teaching textile techniques. Just I'm using those and the possibilities of different textiles, right? So also I want to say that I approach the pedagogical projects as if they were artistic projects. So that changed everything for me, and that changed everything that you do inside the classroom, right? And like Scott already said at the beginning, I live and work here in Mexico City. So here, to face a pandemic and the educational situation, the government created this project that it calls Aprende en Casa. It says, how you can see over there, learn at home. So basically, it's a TV show. That's the truth. So the kids sit down a couple of hours each day in front of the TV, in front of their screens, to watch the lessons and to follow instructions. So they can complete their homeworks, and later then they send those homeworks to their teachers. So the teacher is not a teacher, it's some kind of guide, and the teacher is not like it's not an active teacher. The teacher is only there to receive those homeworks. So that is a really big problem here, and what we are facing now with the pandemic. So this solution, right, made me think about the limits of a classroom, because usually we think our classroom as a space limited by 4 walls, and not as a space itself. So you can see the same over here, because the students are in front of a screen, of some kind of box, and they are inside their homes, and they are inside the rooms, and they are again inside a box. So the government think that the classroom is a box, right? So that is really problematic, because for me, the space is the classroom. So and it is the body and the presence of the students and also the teachers that modifies that space and decides the limits. So okay, so I work with 3 strategies to play and to stretch the space and their boundaries. So I'm going to show you. So the first one is artistic intervention. The second one is to walk. to walk through the space. And the third one is mapping, okay? So the first one, this is an artistic intervention. I will show you a couple of samples. So we did this intervention inside the university campus here in Mexico City at UNAM. And we use traditional indigenous textiles to learn about symmetry and homothetic. So once we explain the different concepts, the participants knit, how you can see over there, their own designs on the fence using traditional native designs as an inspiration. So this was really fun because we start the activity at one place of the campus, and then we walk through the campus looking for a place to knit. So the students chose the place and the fence where they wanted to work. So the limits and the space of our classroom was modifying all the time, right? Not only by the knit, but also by the walk through all the university. So the space was flexible and the boundaries were completely flexible. And also the students and also the teachers chose those spaces and those boundaries, and they change it all the time while they were walking through the spaces. We start in one point and then we walk through the other point. So that changed completely what you think about the limits, and that of course that changed the space between four walls, right? So I just want to say that the participants were university students, or they were linked in different ways to the university. So they were using these same academic spaces in different ways. And also for the first time, they were learning outside the buildings and outside the limits that they call classroom. So in that moment, the classroom was a different thing. They were outside those places, right? So this is a little bit of what we did. You can see like the symmetry over here, and we have, I'm going to play just this. It's super short, the video, so you can see how they knit on the fence. Okay. Then also, I think mapping for me works really, really well. So this is a textile mapping and artistic installation that I did with my students at UACM. So the objective of this activity was to create a cartography using designs and techniques of different native traditional textiles. That was the main object. But I have to say that the university where I did this project is located in a space where people who migrate from other states made their home. That's why the students are still tied to their communities of origins and to their traditions, and that changed everything. So while we were mapping the textiles, the students identified and resignified themselves and their own traditions. So in that moment, we realized that we should integrate their experience into the final work. It was not only about the textiles, it was not only about like the formal values of the textiles, the colors, the techniques. We realized that their own experience was really, really important for this work. So we did this map, we mapped this. So most of them were women. So we embroidered the word woman in different native languages on paper maps, and then we sew them all together, and we create a collaborated land and a new territory. So this is like a creative new territory for them. And in this map, we mapped their experience and managed to unite their native territories with the urban spaces where they live now. So the classroom was a created land and collaborated land. And this new land and this new classroom also was displayed in a shared and in a public place. So you can see that here the classroom are exactly their experiences, and also the boundaries are flexible, the space is flexible, and we are sharing in a public space. So all those walls aren't there anymore, right? We are mapping the feelings, we are mapping the textiles, we are mapping the experience inside the classroom, and we put it outside to share it with the others. And okay, so this was a really exciting experience, because my students resignified their territories, but also the way they live in their new urban spaces. So that was really an emotional space for them, and they create like, well, we all create like a new way to think the classroom, and a new way to make significant education with them. So the boundaries were something in the middle of the places where they used to live, where the families of them used to live, and the new places that they are living in right now. So it was really cool. Okay, and I'm going to show you just this one, the last one. So we have to think about what is happening now with the online classroom, right? We are talking about that, and I think it's very important to think about what we are going to do with these online classrooms. And well, with the pandemic and the remote educations, our classrooms and our screens and our spaces are again small rooms and are again inside four walls, right? And I was thinking about this, and I thought that I can work with my students to change that. They are all the time in front of the screens. They are all the time inside a space. And I needed to change that. They are all the time looking their screens. So with this special work, I want them to change the space, to change the physical space limited by those four walls, and also change that box that is the screen, right? That is the notebook that is in, or the computer that is in front of them. In this, what I did is we work with embroidery, and I work this embroidery to keep the students away from the screens and away from that remote education, where they can use their bodies. Because you see, the body is exactly what changed those boundaries. That is what they use to change it and to transform those boundaries. So in this way, they can use their body, they can use their hands to make the embroidery also. And that also helps them to calm down, because that's true. They are like, some of them are really angry, some of them are really sad. So they also need to just step away one moment from the screens and use their body in different ways and in specific ways. So when you use the materiality of the textiles, is some kind of meditation, and that helps them also to calm down. So with this work, we were analyzing these different texts, and we tried to identify the connotatives and the notatives words, but also we realized we make tangible the relationship between the text and the textile. And also they were calming. They were really calm because they were using their hands in different ways. They weren't watching all the time the screen. And when we finished this exercise, I decided that it was really good to map the place where they live. So as they turn in, because they have to turn in their final works, they also shared their location, mapping our classroom through the city. I'm going to show you. So the finished works are, well, these are a couple of them. And then we did this Google map. And each of them just map the place where they live. So they can invent their own names because, you know, some maybe they don't want to tell us their names, or they don't want to share with everybody where they live. So they just write, for example, alumno uno. So there is their work and where they live. So then student 2, and there is the work and where they live. So they map, yes, where they live. And in this way, the boundaries can be big enough to include all the students, regardless of the physical locations. So this is really, really good for all of us, because we see that we are still in a classroom. We don't have those 4 walls to limit us. The classroom is big enough to include all of us, and this also like make us make a relationship different between all the students, because some of them they didn't know in person. They only know by the classroom, by the online, the remote classroom, by Zoom, by Teams. So in this way, they know where are the others, and the relation between them just changed in different ways. So we did this, and we think that also helped us to stretch the boundaries and to keep flexible the space of the classroom. So the truth is, for me, the classroom exactly is the space. The classroom is and depends of the body, and depends of the presence of the teacher and the presence of the students inside that space. But that space must be flexible, and those boundaries can change and can be modified with our presence and with our bodies. I'm not talking only about the students, but I'm talking also about the teachers. So I think we have to think exactly what makes a classroom, right? It could be, like Scott said, a space. Maybe it could be just those boundaries. It could be also the teacher and the students, and it could be the relationship between the space, the teacher, the boundaries, and the students. So I think I am working with that, and these are just a couple of examples to show you that a classroom is a lot of things. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bianca. And now we will have our last panelist for the evening, Dr. Erica Halverson.
All right. Greetings, everyone. What an honor to be able to share some ideas with this great panel. You know, I am not a Cape artist, and so I feel a little like an interloper, which is partly why I wanted to go last, to have an opportunity to hear what these folks who are deep in this work are talking about. I am gonna shift gears a little bit to a slightly more abstract take, which I hope can provide like a little bit of languaging to share across our context and across our examples. I wear, I think, 3 different hats that are related to this. So I'm a professor of curriculum and instruction at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So like Dr. Reyes, I work with pre-service teachers. I teach arts integration, I teach technology integration. I also have conducted a series of research projects over the past 15 plus years of my career, where I've studied various kinds of arts organizations to understand how young people learn in and through the arts. And those organizations have ranged from Chicago local organizations like Street Level Youth Media to organizations in Southeastern Kentucky and Appalachia, to organizations located on Native reservations, and everything in between. I also have a third hat. For those of you who are longtime Chicagoans, I am the co-founder of the erstwhile Barrel of Monkeys, now called Playmakers Laboratory Theater. So I started my first baby, I like to say, was a creative arts organization working in Chicago public schools and elementary schools on creative expression. I now run a similar program here in Madison called Whoopin' Soccer, which takes a similar approach to working with mostly elementary school kids on creative writing and performance and improvisation, and works with professional artists to create performance pieces of young writers' expressions as a way to sort of validate and professionalize their creativity. So I have three intersecting hats that guide the way I think about this work. And I never thought I would be this person, but I am writing a book. It is called How the Arts Can Save Education. It's going to be published by Teachers College Press. And one of the chapters in the book is called How the Arts Can Save Curriculum and Design. And I'm going to share a few ideas from that chapter that I think resonate very closely with a lot of the examples and the comments that were made by our three fabulous speakers. So, nope. Yes. So the first thing that I want to shift our language from, and Bianca really teed this up nicely, and we didn't plan it, but I think it works really well, is that I want to shift our language from talking about classrooms to talking about learning environments, to create a more inclusive and broader definition of how and where teaching and learning happen. You know, that's obviously brought into pretty sharp relief in our current context, but it has also been true for a very long time. And as arts educators, we know that, right? A learning environment is an after-school program. It's also a video game. It's also the intersection of the multiple spaces and places where teaching and learning happen. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by requiring that we fit the language of schooling. And I think we can take a more assertive stance by asking them to fit into our language. And I think one avenue that opens up when we create this more expansive language is that we can think about our work in terms of design, so that design becomes a way of doing curriculum. Oop, nope, not yet. How do I go back? Oh, son of a gun. There. Of creating learning experiences and taking advantage of what we know people can take from arts-based learning experiences. So what I want to do is use the language of design to leverage our strengths as doers and makers of art to reimagine what's possible in a learning environment. And by design, I don't just mean design, but I mean design for. So, you know, the Fitbit, for example, right? It's lovely and sleek, but it also affords particular behaviors on the part of its users, right? It's designed for us to move around. It's designed for us to get up when it tells us to. It's designed for us to keep track of the ways we move through the world. So I'm not talking about design in the purely aesthetic sense, although there are obviously aesthetics connected to design, but in the also in the sort of engineered sense of design as a use, as a practice for use. And further, I don't just mean design for, but I mean design for what I would call intentional learning. And by learning, I mean acquiring new content, creating new artifacts or meaning or relationships, or being somehow different as a result of the experience. And then by intentional, what I mean is that as designers of learning environments, deciding what we want people to learn and then creating the conditions for that learning to take place. And this is, of course, the hardest part about design. If any of you are familiar with Etienne Wenger and Jean Lave's work on communities of practice, they have a really lovely way of talking about learning as something that happens while learning something is an entirely different matter. So learning is always happening. Almost every interaction we have in the world results in some kind of learning. But as educators, we want learning of a particular kind or of a particular thing. And so the intentionality that we bring to a design process is the most challenging task that we have as arts educators. So what I want to propose, and I don't think this is super revolutionary to y'all, but I think the readership that I'm intending for this book, which is a more general education audience, and also folks who engage in the world of education, parents and education adjacent folks, all those people often think of the arts as extra or as something nice to have, or if it is a core, it is a self-contained set of ideas and activities independent of the other ways that we think about schooling. What I want to argue is the arts practices themselves are the organizing framework for the design of learning environments. And so what we all know about how good arts practice happens is the framework for talking about the design of productive learning environments. And I want to share very briefly with you 3 design principles that will be in the book and exist around a world of exemplars from my own research, from other folks' research, from my own practice. I'm not going to go into those examples here because we've already heard many examples of this from the other 3 folks. So my hope is that some of this more abstract stuff that I'm describing resonates with some of the earlier examples. If we were in a room together, we would do this as an improv activity called 3 Things, where somebody would give me, say to me, Erica, give us 3 design principles for how the arts can reframe the design of learning environments. And I would say 1, conceive, represent, and share. And you'd say 1, and then I would give you the second. You'd say 2, and then 3, and 3 things, but we're in a virtual environment and I can only see 3 people, so it's not that fun. Going back just one sort of justification moment, people will often ask me, and again, I don't think this group is in this space, but why should the arts serve as the framework for the design of learning environments? And I often share that many folks, and particularly the recent generation of scholars looking at informal learning environments, folks like Henry Jenkins, Mimi Ito, Kylie Pepler, these are kind of field leaders in US-based informal education research, have described the kinds of environments that young people are the most successful in as participatory cultures. And in their descriptions of participatory cultures, they often talk about how artistic expression is itself the learning. And this from a group who are not artists and didn't necessarily go into their exploration of informal learning environments looking for art making, but in fact, that's what they found. And so what I've tried to do is say, okay, if that's the phenomenological side, so if they went in and said, what's happening here, and found that artistic expression is the mechanism for learning, how can we treat that as a set of design principles? So 1, conceive, represent, share. What I find almost universally in all the arts-based learning environments that I am in is that the young people who are participating are constantly occupied in a cycle of conceiving of ideas, using the tools of the medium to represent those ideas as embedded within the micro and macro grammars of that particular art form, and then sharing those ideas with a legitimate and public audience. Now, again, this is probably not news to us, but if any of you have ever been inside of a school, this is not the typical organizing framework for a learning task. It maybe should be, but we often don't think of the fundamental mechanism for learning as a cycle of conceiving, representing, and sharing. I know that we saw evidence of that in the 3 prior talks, and I'm happy to go back and forth with y'all some more about whether and how you think this resonates as sort of the primary mechanism for engaging in learning. The second design principle involves assessment. And what we know from arts work is that good assessment is authentic, it's embedded, and it's constant. And again, probably not revolutionary to a group of engaged arts educators, but certainly not the way we frame the task of assessment in most schools. The notion that an assessment ought to be authentic to the task that is being accomplished or the content that is being learned is almost orthogonal to the way we've designed a lot of summative assessments in schools, right? Don't use your textbook, don't actually write something that an audience could understand, write for the teacher, pretend I don't know anything, answer this series of pre-designed questions that are never going to be used for anything else. Inauthenticity is often the marker of standardized assessments in schools. The embedded nature of assessment is something that arts practices do naturally. You are constantly critiquing, revisiting, understanding the ways in which your work can be improved through interactions with others. And I am, like Dr. Reyes, quite inspired by a lot of the Reggio Emilia philosophy around the role of documentation in learning as a form of assessment. And when I teach pre-service teachers, we often learn about the difference between documentation and display as forms of assessment, and how the role of critique and embedded view of process, and constant, right? So in schools, we often, we think about formative assessments, we think about check-ins, but we see those as disconnected from the eventual, the big test, the big paper. In these arts-based practices, all of that is always ongoing and connected from one stage to another. The third principle I want to share is what I call ideas first, tools second. So my good friend and colleague, a man named Jim G., who is a now retired professor from Arizona State, who was one of the grandfathers of the field of sociolinguistics. So was part of the group of folks in the 1980s and 90s who looked at functional linguistics and tried to understand how social and cultural and historical features intersect with the way we express ourselves through talk, through writing, through embodiment. And in the later part of his career, Jim turned to video games as learning environments. And he wrote a pretty well-known book in the early 2000s called, I think it's something like What Good Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning. It's something like that. If you Google Jim G and good video games, the book will come up. And he's got like 36 design principles in there. But one of the ones that he describes is what he calls just-in-time learning, which is the idea that you learn something best when you actually need it. So when that tool becomes relevant for you in your practice, that's when you're actually going to be able to use it. And in art, I believe that is also true in arts practice. So I've seen many, many times, particularly in digital art making, young people struggling to learn, say, a video editing program until they know that what they want to do is juxtapose one scene with another. Then you're darn tootin' they figure out how their version of Final Cut allows them to make the kind of juxtaposition that they want to make. So the ideas and the concepts for communication always precede the way that we come to understand how the tools work. And again, I'm a little bit of a broken record, perhaps obvious to this group of accomplished arts educators, often not the way curricula are designed in schools, right? You learn the formula, then you do the math. You learn the parts of a cell, then maybe you get to look at a microscope. You memorize the periodic table, and then you figure out, what is the conceptual chemistry behind why these elements are stacked up the way that they are. So the ideas first, tools second is really grounded in this notion of just-in-time learning, and how I've observed and enacted over and over again the ways in which young people learn to use the tools as they have a need for their own artistic practice. And I think I'll just end by summarizing and saying that it's my belief, and probably the belief of many in this group, that the arts can move us from being stuck with this idea of curriculum or classroom, right? We teach teachers to use a curriculum to teach students. It can move us from curriculum to design, and hopefully can move us from the notion of classrooms to the notion of learning environments. And so hopefully my three co-presenters see a lot of the ideas from their work embedded in these more abstract principles. And I'm really excited to hear from them about whether and how these ideas resonate, especially since the book isn't published yet. So ideas always welcome. Thanks.
Thank you, Erica. Wonderful. Wonderful panelists all. And I do want to see what questions folks have. It's 5:37, so we still have some time. And then also panelist questions you have for each other. But I want to go back to my promise at the beginning. Phil Cotton, are you still there? I don't see Phil is there. He stepped away from the chair. I can see right now. Okay, that's okay. Maybe when Phil comes back, I wanted to see if Phil had some reactions. Because Phil, as I said at the beginning, asked the question, what is a classroom, about 20 years ago. All right, so folks, what questions do you have, or panelists questions for each other? Do any of our audience attendees have questions you'd like to share? Thinking about it, that's fine. I actually was, let's see. Bianca, I was something Erica said made me think about your use of indigenous textiles. So Erica talked about how the just-in-time learning, that you learn best when you really need something. And I remember when you and I first talked, you have this indigenous textiles practice, but you're using it in a very contemporary context, not in a, if you allow, maybe I have this wrong, but it doesn't seem to me like a folkloric context. And you're not turning your students, whether primary or university, into art historians of textiles. So was there anything, I wondered when Erica talked about just-in-time learning, like learning something when you really need to use it. Did that have any resonance in terms of how you think about using textiles in this very contemporary way?
Well, yes, of course, because well, I think that links to my own art practice. I use it when I need it, and now I teach with them because I needed to teach something. Of course, that sounds really familiar for me, and yes, I use it to make more fun, to learn maths also. And yes, in that moment I needed something else to teach them maths, right? And to teach everything, and also to learn about their own spaces and how to walk through those spaces, right? And how to create like something really different from the origin of those things. So I needed I needed to change the definition of those textiles and change it completely, and that was really important for me. So of course I use it when I need it, right? But also there's another thing that Erica just said about share. So like you said, like at the end of that process, we used to share, right? So, well, yes, we share it, but sometimes the students don't like to share. They don't like it, especially when like between 12 and 16 years old, when they finish their works and you say, okay, now you are going to share it with the other ones, they say, no, I don't want to. I don't want anybody to see what I did because it could be really ugly. Maybe it is ugly. Maybe they are going to criticize me. So the idea of share sometimes when you are in the classroom change. They share, sometimes they share it between them, but there's a lot of problems with sharing at the end of that process, because for me, like that sounds familiar, and I think that is the last step of this process, but sometimes it is not, because there's a lot of things just going on over there between the students, and sometimes they don't want to share, and you have to be like you have to respect that. So sometimes it's just a process and you don't share nothing at the end. So that makes me feel I don't know, that is, I don't know if you are thinking about sharing in a different way or how you think this share thing. I don't know, Erika.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I would like to sort of yes and your comment. So first of all, I am thinking about sharing in a large range of ways, right? And you know, traditional classrooms have sharing. It's called you write a paper and you give it to the teacher, right? So, you know, we very infrequently acknowledge that that is a form of sharing, and we assume by contract, you know, that students are going to share with their teacher. And what I would say is, when I think about teaching as a pedagogical act, I focus on the scaffolding of risk taking that's required for art making, which is also required, frankly, for all good classroom practice. But again, in traditional classrooms, we tend not to acknowledge the risk taking involved in participating successfully in a learning environment. So, I would imagine it certainly has not been uncommon for me to go into a traditional classroom and see, 22, 13-year-olds. I mean, I have a 14-year-old. I see how the turning on and off of cameras works, right? And I understand the risk taking that's involved in that. But my response would be, that's our job as instructional leaders to scaffold that risk taking so that sharing in some form can be a part of successful learning practice. And so I know that as teaching artists, we often walk into learning environments where that hasn't happened, right? So you come in halfway through the year and here's a vaguely hostile middle school group, right, where they have not established a culture of critique and sharing. And you can either take that on yourself as a teaching artist, which is challenging, or you can say what I think you've smartly said, which is, in some of those environments, I have to be respectful of the culture of that space. And if risk-taking is not built in, then I will deal with whatever the culture of risk-taking and sharing is. So I don't know if that speaks to your experience. You're nodding, so I hope that it is. But that's sort of how I think about the relationship between sharing and risk-taking and what's required in a learning environment.
That's wonderful exchange. I want to point out, and we'll come to this in a moment, Maya McCarthy initiated a great conversation here in the chat box. Phil, I see you're here. Hey, buddy, did you want to make any comments about what is a classroom and what you heard tonight? You're on mute, Phil. Phil, you're on mute. There you go.
Okay. Hi, Scott. Thank you. The presenters, all of it was very interesting to me. And I still, after all these years, it's really funny to look at that picture you have of Margie and I up there. I feel like an old codger. But I still view education and working with kids as, my word that I give to it is gyroscopic. And the learning, I found that over the years that some of it is still the same in the sense that you have to establish where that kid is at, where that student's at internally. And that you can use also to help educate that kid. Like when we did those chairs, we were doing, actually, I was teaching them ownership, because so many of them, there's very little that they owned in their environment. This was a way for them to practice some kind of respect and ownership. And I think moving forward, in the other schools that we worked at, even like South Shore, it was similar things. There was family. We looked at family, we looked at spaces, how to define their spaces, how to give them some control over their spaces. And now we're in this remote environment situation. So now it's like, how do we define education and educating those students and the community in this kind of environment? And so listening to the different presenters gave me a lot of ideas. I definitely took a lot of notes, guys. And I appreciate what everybody was saying, but it is a challenge. It is very much a challenge. It still is very exciting. You have to be excited about it or you should be involved in it. And I have found that moving forward, I know what Margie and I plan to do is actually helping students to redefine who they are in this environment and where they can go moving forward, culturally and educationally. So that's the way I'm looking at it. And thank you all for presenting.
Thank you, Phil. So panelists, you've probably seen this now in the chat. Maya wrote, I'm curious about what folks hope to keep from their current practices when schools return to meeting in person, in school together. Does anyone have any comment? That's an interesting question because, well, actually, I'll stop there. Do any of the panelists have a response to that?
I mean, oh, Gustavo, you go.
Oh, Erica, please.
All right, I'll take quickly. Whoop and Soccer, the program that I run in Madison, we've converted our residencies to virtual residencies that are primarily asynchronous, where young people, we've created this video series, and then they're responding to Google Forms that are embedded in their virtual classrooms. And none of that we want to keep. But one thing we have noticed is that when young people are asked to share their stories via their Chromebook, whether that's because they're typing or because they're creating a quick video using Flipgrid, or they're writing and snapping a picture, we actually get more stories from them than when we give them what we have traditionally given them, which is a paper notebook to write in. And so I think when we go back in the classroom, we will still offer the Chromebook as the means of creating and storing expressions and ideas. Even though we will be interacting with them in the classroom, I think we're going to hold on to the computer because it seems more available to them than the traditional notebook.
Thank you, Erica. Gustavo, did you have a response
Thank
to
you very
Maya's?
much for your question. Yeah, for sure. Well, especially for me, I think there's something about the ways of communicating with the students, and there's something about technology in the expansion of senses or ways of exploring or ways of interacting with the city and with the environment or with the neighborhoods. I mean, we take a look at Bianca's presentation, for example, the idea of expanding the map of the city to where other people live and what's around them. There's something very interesting in all of this. It was interesting to me that to communicate with the students, I was actually doing what I was asking them to do. That means making films. So I would make short films. And then I was making like, we were planning to, we had an exercise that we would have to connect the inside of your house with the outside of your, or with the outside. So I did have to take my cat and film it and make him, as he was thinking about something, and then I would go to a tree, and then the cat was flying in the tree. So I was really making that, like with the effort of technology to communicate with them. So I think there's an expansion of the possibilities of the senses that will remain. I mean, I really miss being with people and using the cameras with them. But as far as we can communicate at a distance, that also enriches a lot the work with the kids, I think.
Thank you, Gustavo. Juana or Bianca, did you want to respond to this line of query?
I can say something. I would say that for me, in terms of working with students at the university, I think certainly, I mean, there were aspects of, or there still are aspects of being remote that offer a convenience because we can meet at different times. We're not bound to a specific meeting time on campus. I think sometimes people have trouble getting to campus at a certain time or a certain hour, right? Other than to meet on an impromptu. So I think some of the structure of being able to meet with adults over Zoom, I think it's a different thing with young children, especially particularly young children. I think we should really revisit. I know that from my students, some of them, it ranges from sending out a weekly packet of work for the child to complete, obviously with the parent, because a young child isn't completing a packet of work, at 5 by themselves, right? It ranges from that level, which is very much still bound by classroom rules, the 4-wall classroom rules, to really considering about the opportunity to explore the outside, to explore the environment, to go on walks, to connect. So those aspects, I think, are the things that we should keep as how we engage children and families in a more meaningful way than just making certain that children are completing a certain task by the end of the week or what have you. That sort of, I think right now there's such a very wide range out there that for me, as a researcher, it's about looking at what's really working and what shifts our ideas about education, because as the other presenter said, they can be very limiting, and we should have a voice in what we look like on the other side of this wall of the pandemic.
Yep. Yep. Very good. Bianca, did you have any response?
Yes, I think first of all, for me, it's like opportunity to stretch those boundaries of the 4 walls, right? Using like different apps and different ways to just like to navigate the world, like Gustavo says about the cities, about you can just visit a museum right now. So that is like the first thing I think I'm going to keep trying and I'm going to keep using in my classroom. But also the second one, and I think it's very important, that right now we are really concerned about the context of our students, because we can see that context, right? We can see their houses and their place where they live in, and everything that is happening over there is like really important in the way they are learning and in the way we are teaching. So for me, it is really important to just be aware of those things, because I don't know you, I know that those things are really important when they are inside our classrooms, but now we see those contexts. So for me, I can see them. They are like tangible things, right? I can see where they live. I can see if they have called if they need to eat, I see them eating all the time. They are just taking everything in certain hours. So I think those are real needs. And for me now, that is really important. And I'm aware of those things. And I think when if we have again our classrooms, I'm will be more aware of those necessities and how they feel and how they live, and how what I'm teaching them is going to be significant and is going to be important in that spaces. For me, that is something that I'm learning right now, and I must be, and I'm all the time watching what is in their context to learn about that and to use that in my class. So I think that is really important.
Beautifully said, and it connects to something Leon wrote. I certainly hope that we keep understanding the student's home environment as meaningful for the education experience. I remember in some of our past dialogues and at the beginning, this is something that we thought about too at CAPE. I mean, so much of the conversation has connected to rethinking time and space and the body in relation to the classroom. And when this all started, we wrote about this at CAPE, this long century we've had of disconnect between home and school environment really now should be put aside. I mean, that really should come to an end, because it should instead be more of a continuum. And when we had a discussion about family-centered learning recently, we also, I mean, that's about space, but we also thought about time, because the school day itself as a construct certainly doesn't make sense in remote learning, but maybe it doesn't make sense after we come together as well. Maybe there's another way that we actually rethink how the school day itself or how time functions. These questions shouldn't be put aside. You sense that the great impetus of a school system, that is the upper bureaucracy, is always to preserve the status quo and maintain the hegemony. But the next struggle after we come together is actually going to be how can we fight against that and bring back this powerful thing that we've had of rethinking educational space and educational time and the body as a educational component. So we're at time. I want to thank our amazing panel. It was absolutely fantastic. I'm thrilled to pieces. I want to tell you, everyone, that the dialogue will be posted on the CAPE Network forum. So this is recorded, and we will post it so anyone can access it publicly afterwards. And I also want to mention that I'm going to do a plug here if I can find it. Joseph and Mark can help me here it is. So we have What is a Network? So after What is a Classroom, we're going to do What is a Network on December 16th from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. And What is Publicness, which I believe now is February 4th from 4 to 6 p.m. as well. So stay tuned to CAPE, and stay tuned to all our amazing panelists, because they are incredible. And I thank them all so much. A virtual round of applause all around. Yes. So thanks, everyone, and have a great night. I appreciate it all so much.